we want to look at the final act this week. Look at Act 3, but we're only going to do Scene 1. We'll do Scene 2. We'll save that for next week, and talk about that in some more detail. And so, looky here. As we're looking at Act 3, Scene 1, we've already looked at Act 1. God establishes the kingdom of God in creation. Act 2, rebellion in the kingdom. And we talked about that big, important aspect of the fall. Now, finally, as we begin Act 3, we're going to talk about restoration. Now, notice that restoration is a term that is used in the remainder of the story. But we have different aspects of that restoration. We have restoration initiated, we have restoration accomplished, and restoration completed. And we're just talking about, for this next couple of lectures, restoration initiated. Most of the story of the Old Testament, beginning in the middle of Genesis, really beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis, going all the way through even into Joshua and Judges to some extent, is this, a restoration initiated goes all the way from there, all the way to the end of the Old Testament and even into the interlude. So let's talk about this. Our key passages in this section are Genesis chapters 37 and then chapters 39 through 45. Please read these chapters. I've abbreviated the required reading quite a bit, but still there's a good number of chapters, and that's where the majority of the content is coming from, especially as you get into the quizzes and as you get into the exams and the writing. You need to have that knowledge in order to do those essays for each of the bigger units that we're going to do. Exodus chapter 1 through 14, chapters 19 and 20, and then on into Deuteronomy chapter 6, and then very briefly in Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30. So as we look at these key figures, we're going to always see God really as a key figure throughout the story. We're going to talk briefly in this section about Jacob, and then we're going to talk at length about Joseph and Moses. And then we'll dig into the key themes that we can highlight here in Act 3, Scene 1. So first, let's just talk a little bit about Jacob. Now, Abraham, after chapter 11, where we talked about the fall of the Tower of Babel, after that, God calls Abraham out of the land of Ur and tells him he's going to go to a land that he's going to show him. And even though he and his wife Sarah do not have any children, God is going to give them children, and ultimately God will tell him, your children and your descendants will outnumber the grains of sand on the sea, if you could count them, and the stars of heaven, if you could count those. And so he promises him that he'll become a father of great nations. And Abraham and Sarah eventually have their son Isaac, although they have others that are, Abraham has other sons, but not by Sarah, and Sarah's the promised bride and part of that. And then they have Isaac, and then Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob, even though he's really far from a perfect character, his name, in fact, means heel grabber, which is kind of a Hebrew way of saying trickster. And so Jacob becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And all the stories that we know of the 12 tribes in Israel, those 12 tribes trace their heritage back to one of Jacob's 12 sons. Now, Jacob and his wife kind of played favorites. They were most fond of their two own sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And some of the other brothers who were half-brothers to Joseph and Benjamin were jealous of that, even though they were themselves sons of Jacob and well-respected and what will eventually be founders of tribes. They were jealous of him and all of his doings. And so they betrayed him. Their initial thought was to put him to death. But then a couple of them came to their senses and knew that was wrong. And so they did something else that was still wrong, but not as bad as murder. They sold him off into slavery to a group of nomads. Those nomads took Joseph and traveled on down to Egypt and eventually sold him into slavery into a wealthy and influential person in Egypt. Joseph is seen to be as a good servant. He's an attractive young man. He will keep the story short here, but the wife of this wealthy individual tries to bed Joseph, and Joseph knows that is wrong, knows that's not appropriate, and knows it's a betrayal of his master, and knows it's a betrayal of God's design for marriage, and he refuses. The woman is not a righteous woman, and she falsely accuses of Joseph of trying to rape her. And Joseph, being a servant and being powerless, ends up in prison. And while he is in prison, this gift that he's had for a lifetime, that's this ability to interpret dreams. He interprets dreams because God reveals these dreams to him and their meaning to him. Joseph interprets the dreams for a couple of people who are imprisoned with him. Now, these two people just happen to be servants from Pharaoh's household. Joseph prophesies that one of them in 3 days is going to be taken out and hanged, and the other is going to be restored to his proper place in the house of Pharaoh, and all will be well for him. Of course, this man is described as the cupbearer because he's the cupbearer to Pharaoh. This man promises Josephus that when this happens, he will speak to Pharaoh, and he will tell Pharaoh, this is a good man, and he doesn't deserve to be in prison, and you should release him. But when the cupbearer gets there, he forgets all about Joseph and goes about his job until Pharaoh is plagued with dreams, and he can't get any rest. He can't get any relief from these dreams. All of the wise men of Egypt are called to try to help Pharaoh with these dreams, and to no avail. None of them can interpret them. And then the cupbearer says, Pharaoh, I know someone who can interpret these dreams. See, now it's to his advantage to remember Joseph. And he tells Pharaoh the story of Joseph interpreting his dream and the dream of the baker or the bread bearer in Pharaoh's court. And Pharaoh sins for Joseph, and Joseph is able to interpret the dreams, and as the dreams are coming true, Pharaoh is put in charge of the plan to avert the danger that was coming in the dreams. And what happens eventually is Joseph basically becomes second in command of all of Egypt. The only person that has authority over Joseph is Pharaoh himself. So Joseph goes from being betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, betrayed by the wife of his owner's household, thrown into a jail now in slavery, and forgotten by a fellow slave, by a fellow prisoner, to now he becomes second in command of all of the land of Egypt. So God is working through Joseph to provide a part of this restoration, part of this redemption. Now, as Joseph comes into power, and Joseph is in power, a huge famine, that's part of the dreams and what Joseph is doing. A huge famine spreads not just through Egypt, but throughout all of this part of the world. And Joseph's family back in Israel, it's not called Israel yet, but back in Canaan, they're affected by this famine as well. Jacob sends some of his sons with money to go down to Egypt and to buy grain and to bring it back so that the family will not starve. When they get there, unbeknownst to them, the person they have to interact with is their own brother. They don't recognize him. He, of course, looks nothing like he did when he left as a young boy, and now I'm sure he's dressed as an Egyptian and completely unexpected. But Jacob Joseph is able to help his brothers out. He plays with them some, kind of tricking them. He through this process of tricking them, he forces them first to bring back Benjamin, to make sure that Benjamin is still alive. This is his brother, his full blood brother that he has missed desperately. And then he refuses to let Benjamin go and forces them to leave and go back to their father, and bring their father and mother with them to Egypt. And only at this point does Joseph reveal himself to his brothers. And then they go and they fetch their father, and all of Jacob's clan and their herds all come to Egypt, and they are given a place to live, and they live there under the authority of Pharaoh and of Joseph as his right-hand man, and they're able to do, and all goes well until Jacob dies. And then Jacob is buried, and Joseph's brother worry if now Joseph will have his revenge upon them. And I want to read here at the end of Genesis, which is chapter 50. And I want to read at the very end where there's a little dialogue between Joseph and his brothers regarding if they're safe or not. Picking up now in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin. For they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. When his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' But Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. This is the word of the Lord. So we see there Joseph lets them know, no, I'm not going to do evil against you. That this hasn't been a long-held grudge, and I'm going to now get back at you. And we see that Joseph makes a home for them in Egypt, and they become well established, and they become able to continue to fulfill that covenant, to be fruitful and to multiply. And in Egypt, God grows them to become a great people and a great nation. But now, as the story opens in the book of Exodus, and we move from the life of Joseph, we move to the next key figure, and we learn about Moses. We learn that after Joseph's death, a period of time comes about, that eventually a Pharaoh takes the throne, and he did not know and does not know Joseph. And he sees the Israelites as a threat, and he sees them as a separate people group, and so he enslaves all the Israelites in Egypt. In fact, by the time the book of Exodus begins, the Israelites have been enslaved for over 400 years in Egypt. And the book of Exodus opens there in chapter 1 with the people crying out to the Lord to see their slavery and to remember the covenant that he has made for them. So we learn that God does indeed remember them. In fact, God is already at work to deliver them from the hands of the Egyptians. And we see that he's going to do that through a person by the name of Moses. Moses was a Hebrew child. He was born into slavery, born into this oppression, but he was miraculously brought into the house of Pharaoh, and he becomes Moses, part of the household of Pharaoh, and he's recognized as an Egyptian and honored and allowed to live out his life. And then God calls him away from Egypt. And we learn early on in chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus that God calls Moses to go to Pharaoh and to demand that Pharaoh release the Israelites from their slavery and allow them to go and worship Yahweh and become the people and the nation that God has called them to be. And God uses Moses to strike against Pharaoh. Moses is given the message of the plagues. One plague after another is leveled against Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. And God is working these plagues to liberate his people from slavery in Egypt. And I've had you read through Exodus chapters 1 through 14, which includes this whole series of these 10 plagues. As you're reading those, I want you to pay special attention to the 10th plague, because the 10th plague is basically the plague of the angel of death. And God tells Moses that he's going to send this angel of death out over all of Egypt, and that he is going to enter into all of the households of Egypt, and all of the firstborn, both the humans and of their animals, their livestock, the firstborn males of all the households are going to die. The only way that can be prevented is if the houses are marked with the blood of a lamb that have been properly sacrificed. And then the death angel will see that blood mark, that blood stain over the doorway and down the doorpost of those houses, and he will pass over those houses and just kill the others. Well, the word spreads amongst the Israelites, and all the Israelites do just that, and prepare to leave Egypt as they're told to, gather up all their resources and make some provisions of bread and whatnot to leave out immediately following this plague. And but of course none of the Egyptians know, and so they awake to death and destruction the next day following this plague. And they are finally released by Pharaoh. They leave out and they get on the road. Immediately Pharaoh is enraged again and feels like he's made a huge mistake in releasing the children of Israel, and he goes out with his army to try to pursue them. And so the Israelites are now sandwiched between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. We see this story told in chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Exodus. And God splits the Red Sea, where the Israelites are able to walk across on dry land. And then as Pharaoh's army descends into the divide of the Red Sea, God releases the walls of water, and Pharaoh and all of his armies are drowned in the Red Sea, and the Israelites spring forth as a nation on the other side. They then go on and travel to Mount Sinai, and two other chapters that we're reading are chapters 19 and 20, which tells the beginnings of the covenant between God and Israel, which we refer to as the Mosaic covenant. Notably amongst the Mosaic covenant are the Ten Commandments. And in Exodus 20, there at the very beginning of the chapter, we actually find the Ten Commandments. And I want you to make sure that you pay special attention to the discussion in our textbook by Goheen and Bartholomew on the Ten Commandments. They just do a fantastic job here on pages 46 and 47. Begins at the bottom of page 46 and continues on through the bottom of page 47. I want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about that here in a few minutes. But so in Exodus chapter 20, we learn about the Ten Commandments and the covenant. In the following pages of Exodus, we're going to learn that they also are called to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle is going to be really a house, a tent, to contain the power and the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant is going to be built and be contained in the very centermost part of this tabernacle, what's known as the Holy of Holies. And the Ark of the Covenant is to be seen as the throne of God himself. And as evidence of this, God tells them that he's going to put a pillar of fire over the tabernacle. And during the night, a pillar of fire, and during the day, a pillar of smoke. And they are to stay with the tabernacle. And when God wants them to move, then he'll take the pillar of fire or the pillar of smoke and he'll move it off the tabernacle. And this is the sign to them that they are to pack everything up, the tabernacle and all of their possessions and all of their tents, and they are to move and follow the pillar until it comes to a stop, and then they are to set up camp only where it says to stop as well. And what happens is they are bound to God through this covenant, through the law, and this is what really makes them the people of the Lord. They are in a covenant shaped by the Lord himself. He gives them manna and quail, as well as water as they proceed through the desert. And really, the stories of Exodus are primarily not only about the Exodus, obviously by its name, the Exodus from Egypt, but the formation of the people and the building of the tabernacle is told in its entirety twice in the book. That's how important it is. Now, as you read on in the first 5 books of the Bible, and we didn't have any required reading in the book of Leviticus or in the book of Numbers, but we do have some reading in the Goheen and Bartholomew text on those, and I want you to read those. Leviticus emphasizes the role of the priesthood and their call to help the people of God be holy like God is holy, and to tell them how to deal with the contamination that comes from sin. And how everything needs to be reclaimed as holy and dedicated for the Lord. And we hear that in Leviticus. Then in Numbers, we also hear a lot of the story of the journey through the wilderness, and the end of the book of Numbers and the beginning of Deuteronomy puts them on the outside of the Jordan River, about to enter into the land that God has promised them. And we see that story told fully in Joshua and Judges as they go into conquest, to conquer the land and to settle the land, as that narrative is told. And that's in a latter section of the story. We want to focus primarily on this issue of becoming the people of God, and what defines them as the people of God is the law and God's relationship with them that we see in the tabernacle. And then also, as we get to Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is basically a collection of Moses' sermons, and this collection is used to, I'm reading from Bartholomew, or Goheen and Bartholomew now, on page 53. Deuteronomy records the sermons Moses uses to equip the Israelites for their new task as they prepare to enter the land. These sermons present Israel with a vision of their calling as God's covenant people, a society brought together under the authority of God alone, a people bound to God by his covenant with them, and a people for the sake of the nations. Now let's let's talk about that for just for just a second here, and unpack that a little bit. Here we see it said that these sermons present Israel with a vision of their calling as God's covenant people. So in other words, the stories and the sermons of Deuteronomy show Israel what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to be like as the people of God. The first aspect of that is that they are to be under the authority of the Lord. They don't need a king. They don't need a leader like a king. All they need is God. God is their king. He is their ruler. And they are to follow him. And he's going to speak to them through his prophets. Just as he spoke through Moses and Aaron and Miriam, who were his prophets up to this point, God is going to continue to speak to Israel through his prophets, people like Joshua, people like the various judges. I know we don't normally think of them as prophets, but indeed they are, because they speak for God and they're a liaison between God and his people. Then as we get to Samuel, we see Samuel as a great prophet of God who talks to the kings, but they don't listen very well. But back to the main point here. Deuteronomy teaches us that the people of Israel are a society that are brought together under the authority of the Lord alone. They're also a people who are bound to God by his covenant with them. They are to keep his covenant, and he's made that very clear what they are to do. And then, just as importantly, they're also supposed to be a people for the sake of the nations. God never teaches the Israelites that they are the chosen for themselves, but they're the chosen to be the lighthouse to the nations. They are to show the rest of the nations what people of your earth are supposed to be like. They're supposed to be the model for humanity so that all of humanity can come into a right relationship with the Lord himself. They're not to isolate themselves from the world or kick the world out or wish condemnation on the world, but rather they're to engage the world with God's laws so that they can know God and know how to be in a right relationship with him. Now, I want us to look at a couple of passages. The first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is really one of the most significant passages in all of the Old Testament. And you can see it and hear it all through the rest of the biblical text in many different places. Let's read now in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And let's go ahead and start right there in verse 1. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you're going over to possess it, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments which I command to you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, and that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words, which I am commanding you today, shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. This is the word of the Lord. So this passage is really instrumental. This section here, specifically verses 4 and 5, become known as the Shema. And Shema is the Hebrew word that means hear, and it's taken from the first word here. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your might. This prayer, it becomes a daily prayer, morning and night, as it says here in the text. Morning and night, this becomes a daily prayer, and this is the key interpretive verse for all of the biblical text, especially for the Hebrews. The Lord God, He exists. He is one. He's King of the universe, and you have a responsibility to love Him. You are to love Him with your entire being, with your heart, with your strength, with your soul, with all of your might. You are to love Him above all else. This is the center of what we might call Pharisaic Judaism, or this is central here in the Mosaic covenant. Everything else comes forth here. And I would also add that when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? Guess what? He cites this. He says, you know the commandments. The first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul and your might. And Jesus adds, and the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And he brings together both those vertical relationships of God and man, and those horizontal relationships, man with himself and man with others. And so this is a very, very important part of the biblical passage. Now, I also want us to look at Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30, and I hope you have read those already. The first thing that we see in this passage is a kind of a retelling of God's history with the people. We'll see this several times throughout the Old and New Testament. We call it the Hebrew narrative. It's just telling us that the history of God's relationship with humanity is a source for us to know who we are, who God is, and what our relationship. So in other words, it's showing us that history is embedded with theology. History, we can look to history, especially the history of Israel and the history of the Old and New Testament, as a way to understand who God is, how we should respond to Him, what our responsibilities are. Really, we use it as the foundation, the really exclusive foundation, the authoritative foundation for how we view and perceive all of reality. And we see that Hebrew narrative told here in Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30. Let's read a little bit of that. I want to read over actually in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy. It's after the Hebrew narrative, and how he begins to tell them that if they will stay faithful to God talks about how He shaped them and guided them and given them His law, and now they're getting ready to enter into the land. And as they're getting ready to enter into the land, it's almost as if they're back there in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and they've got to make a decision. Will God's word and God's way be our authoritative? Will it tell us what is right and wrong, or will we usurp that and reject and try to tell what's right and wrong for ourselves? Let's read and see how God talks about them and pleads with them to choose His way, because His way leads to life. See, verse 15, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, His statutes, His judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your hearts turn away, and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. This is the word of the Lord. Man, there are several key things that are there that we definitely want to see and talk about for a little bit. He tells them, I'm putting these two choices before you: life and prosperity, or death and adversity. Now, man, that is a great example of the way that Hebrews often talked about ethics and morality. They often talk about it in what we call two ways wisdom. It's like there are two roads. Can't be on two roads at the same time. You got to pick this road or you got to pick that road. And so we even call this, we even hear this called two ways or two roads wisdom. And God says there's two ways to live. You can live my way, which is the way of life and prosperity, or you can live some other way, whether it be your way or some other God's ways, which there aren't any other gods, some false ideas, some false God's ways, and that leads to death and adversity. And you choose, you choose which way you will go. He tells them, he reminds them to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments. See how he's summarizing all of those things all the way back to that: don't eat from any other tree in the garden, to honor me in all your days, through Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, into Moses now, and to keeping his statutes and commandments, even to earlier into Deuteronomy, in the Shema. All of these things are coming together here. And God says you can now go into this land of prosperity and life, and you can possess it. But, verse 17, but if your heart turns away and you will not obey. See, it's your choice. You're making that decision. You're drawn away and worship other gods and serve them. I declare today that you shall surely perish. Now, just as when he was talking to Eve, if you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. Just as he's talking now, Moses is now talking to the children of Israel, you shall surely perish. Clearly, that's referencing that second death, that final separation from God, and not that you die this moment on earth when you disobey. Sometimes disobedience of God does bring immediate punishment and death in this life. But the one that we should fear is the death and destruction that it brings in the next life. Here he talks about how we can be obedient. He even says he calls heaven and earth to be witnesses against us. He calls the non-created, the non-human order to give witness, to give testimony against us. So the earth, those around us, are going to give testimony against us, or are going to give testimony for us, how we behaved, how we responded. So he says here, in verse 19, so choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God and obeying his voice, by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days. And you can live with your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you can live in the promises and the covenants that are there. And so we see in this Moses' final sermon here, he pleads with them to choose God and to choose life. Now, just briefly, let's talk about some of the key themes. I do like the name of this scene 1, A People for the King. And that really is a big theme that ties us together here. In this section of the biblical text, we see God bringing and shaping his people, calling them out from slavery and from self-destruction, and bringing them to life and prosperity. And so we see the growth of the people group between Genesis and Exodus. We see the deliverance of his people from slavery. We see the Ten Commandments. And and so that we know how we can live in a way that pleases God. Not only does the Ten Commandments, the law, that's not only the way to live that pleases God, but it's also good for us. And it shows what God intended for us to live throughout all creation. He shows also that fulfills the purpose for Israel to be a lighthouse and a witness to the nation. So one big theme is this theme of covenant, and how Israel and the people of God are put into a right relationship with God by coming into covenant. Another big theme that we see here is the fact that God actually dwells with his people. We see this pictured most dramatically in the tabernacle, and how God says that his presence is going to come and be there. We see God's continued care and his providential care. I love that in the story of Joseph, where God uses Joseph to prepare redemption, salvation for all of his brothers, even when they tried to harm Joseph. Joseph said, "What you meant to me as harm, God meant as good, so that we could all find redemption." God's providential care goes sometimes in directions we can't understand and we can't know. The last thing I would say, and this is really something that I'm taking from another textbook on the Old Testament called the Old Testament Survey, a survey of the Old Testament by Hill and Walton. And that is the idea that one of the things we see here, one of the themes that we see here, is that God reveals himself through history. They say, quote, "While God's hand may be seen in all of history, and lessons can be learned from any segment of world history, the history of Israel is unique as it is unique as a specially designed vehicle for God's self-revelation." If you want to read that and find that book, it's on page 176 there in that Hill and Walton text that's called the Survey of the Old Testament. And really this is an important kind of theme for us to understand, is that the biblical text is not just story about people. The story about people reveals to us the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of sin, the nature of reality. In other words, the history of the biblical text shows us what it means to have a Christian worldview and what that Christian worldview looks like. So those are some of those major themes that we can see there. So this is the first section. We've looked at Acts 1 and 2 and the first scene from scene 3. And next week we'll jump in and deal with another rather large section and talk about scene 2, and also talk a little bit about Hebrew poetry, so that we can deal with books like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and a few other books as well. And hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and may the peace of Christ be with you all.